A French artist from the early 1900s, Martin Luther, and a early rabbinic Hebrew interpretive principle. What do these three things have in common? Well, they're all going to actually help us to interpret probably the most well-known miracle in the New Testament, where Jesus walks on the water. That is the gospel reading for this coming Sunday. And we're going to use these various resources to help us to dig into the various layers of this particular story. I think some people have the impression that Jesus walking on the water was just a display of his divine power. Well, okay, you can't argue with that, but it's a whole lot more than that. I'm going to show that there are at least 4 different layers to this particular account in Matthew's gospel. So first of all, who's this French artist that I'm referring to? His name is Francis Picabia. He was active, especially in the first half of the 1900s, and he experimented with various art forms, but he became probably most well known for what were called the transparencies. I'm going to put 2 or 3 of these up on the screen so that you can just kind of get an idea as to how these looked. So as you can tell, they are a layering of picture upon picture, with the final product mixing older and more contemporary images. One reviewer described these as meandering hieroglyphs, or they're like a multi-exposure photograph. But the main point is that they bring together, they layer together all of these various images. Now, I want to look at one in particular. This is based upon the biblical account of Salome. And this is the story that actually directly precedes Jesus walking on the water. So it actually fits in with what we're talking about here. So Salome, if you remember the biblical story, Herod had a birthday party. He was entertained by Salome. She danced, and he was so pleased that he offered to give her up to half his kingdom. She consulted with her mother. Her mother told her that she should ask for the head of John the Baptist, which is exactly what happened. So John is decapitated, his head is brought there and placed upon a platter. So that's the biblical story. Now, if you look at Salome in this transparency by Picabia, there's a whole lot that's going on here that is not just based upon that particular event, but other events. So you have details from other stories here that create this web of meaning. There's an intersection that's going on. You have a multi-layering and a multi-dimensionality to this particular work of art. You have a large face of Jesus that's looming there in outline. You have a woman to the right who's extending her leg into the foreground. You see John's severed head on a platter on the lower left-hand part of the art. You have Herod who's sitting in the background, but then you also have these hints of radiance and a crown of thorns. So there's a lot that's squeezed into this one particular work of art. It pulls from various stories, various images to describe, yes, a historic event, the beheading of John the Baptist. But a whole lot more is happening here, and this art form is able to pull all of this together to make these layers so that we can understand that there's a connection that this story has with a lot of other stories as well. And that's why I wanted to show this to you. Often, art is actually helpful for us in biblical interpretation. And this is a great example of how art can, as it were, give us a framework by which we can read the art of the scriptures, if you will. Because when we're reading story after story in the Bible, it's kind of hard to put them together sometimes. But what's happening in this art form is what the Spirit is doing with all these various kinds of stories. It's pulling them together, image here and image there, and it's putting them into its own kind of transparency so that we can see how everything fits together into God's story, whatever that particular aspect of the story might be. We're going to be doing that when we get to the miracle in just a second. So, transparencies. Now, how does this connect with what I mentioned about the Jewish Hebrew interpretive principle? Well, in this way. The principle itself is this. In Hebrew, it's Ma'aseh Avot Simon Labanim, which is the deeds of the fathers are a sign for the sons. The Ma'aseh Avot, the deeds of the fathers, Simon Labanim, a sign for the sons. What does that mean? It means that what happened to the patriarchs, what happened to the earliest people in the Bible, especially in the Torah, but really especially in Genesis, was a foreshadowing of what was going to happen later, a blueprint, if you will, for what was to be done by the sons and grandsons, so on and so forth. An example that's often used by the rabbis is what happens in Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis 12, Abraham and Sarah, they go down into Egypt because of a famine, and they get into trouble with Pharaoh while they're down there. God plagues Pharaoh, and then they leave laden with the riches of Egypt. All of this, the rabbis say, is to provide a pattern for what is to happen later to Israel, because they end up in Egypt because of a famine. Once again, they get in trouble with Pharaoh. God plagues Pharaoh. They come out laden with the spoils of Egypt. The rabbis put it this way. So this is from an early Jewish commentary. It's called Midrash Rabbah. It's based upon Genesis chapter 12. And the rabbis say this: the Holy One, blessed be he, said to our father Abraham, "Go forth and tread out a path for thy children. For you find that everything written in connection with Abraham is written in connection with his children." So he's invoking that particular interpretive principle of Maaseh Avot Simon Lamanim. What is happening with Abraham is going to be connected with the deeds of the children of Abraham. So the Torah is going to be important because that's where all of these events of the fathers are recorded. And that then leads us from this French artist and this rabbinic saying now to Martin Luther. Because Martin Luther, even though very often he vehemently disagreed with the rabbis, he agreed with them with regard to the Torah being the foundation or the source from which the rest of the scriptures came. So, for instance, in his commentary on Psalm 90, Luther says this: Moses is the source from which the holy prophets and also the apostles, inspired by the Holy Spirit, extracted divine wisdom. So Moses is the one that the prophets went to. Moses is the one the apostles went to extract, to mine, as it were, this divine gold from his writings. In another of his works, called Avoiding the Doctrines of Men, Luther says this: nothing new has been added in the writings after the Pentateuch, for the same thing that is found in the books of Moses is also found in the others. And here we challenge them, he's talking about his opponents, to show us one word in all the books outside Moses that's not already found in the books of Moses. Therefore, everything in the other books is already in the books of Moses, as in a basic source. So in other words, Luther is saying, in concert with what the rabbis themselves said, that if you want to find kind of the Bible within the Bible, you go to the Torah. This is the source, the basic source from which everything was to come in the writings after Deuteronomy. And that's why as the church, we need to keep returning to the Torah again and again and again, because everything in the Bible is built upon this, extrapolates from this, expands upon this, comments upon this. If we don't know the Torah, then we don't know the rest of the scriptures. It would be as foolish not to know the Torah when we're studying the rest of the scriptures would be just as foolish as building a house with no foundation. So we return to the Torah again and again. Okay, so with all that in mind, this is all going to help us when we're interpreting Jesus walking on the water, and not just this particular story, but keep all of these things in mind when you're reading the rest of the New Testament as well. As I said, there's going to be 4 different layers here to the story of Jesus walking on the water. The oldest and deepest of these layers is connected with the creation account. So if you go back to the first few verses of Genesis chapter 1, you read that the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and there was this tohu vavohu, right? This formlessness and void. There was chaos. There wasn't anything that was spoken into order yet. You had darkness, you had water, and then you have the creative spirit that comes to flutter above those waters. Well, all of this is the background for what is happening when Jesus crosses the Sea of Galilee. First of all, it happens in darkness, right? Because this happens between 3 and 6 a.m. It's one of the last watches of the night when Jesus decides he's going to walk over the water. So you have dark waters once more, and you also have chaos because this happens during a storm, right? So you have chaotic waters all around you, you have darkness, and then you have the Creator walking on top of these. He's treading upon that which he himself has created, and he's treading upon that which he is about to speak into unchaos, into order, which is exactly what he, as the Creator, does for his disciples. So don't read the walking on top of the water without connecting it in this transparency that we are artistically creating. Don't read it without connecting it with creation. Okay, that's the oldest and the deepest layer. The second layer is probably the most obvious. So when you think about Jesus crossing a sea in the New Testament, if you have your Old Testament cap on, what are you thinking of? Well, Moses, right? And the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. So you got to read these two stories in tandem as well. Well, how are they parallel? Well, they're parallel in a number of different ways. First of all, you have Moses bringing the Israelites safely across from fear to faith. God creates this canyon, as it were, between the waters so the Israelites can pass through. And one of the Psalms, Psalm 77, says that God is like a shepherd, and he's shepherding his people by the hand of Moses and Aaron. It says that you can't see his footprints, but he's there. He's walking ahead of his people like a shepherd leading his flock from danger to security. And then after he does this, Exodus chapter 14 says that the people believed in Moses and they believed in the Lord. So they now expressed faith. Well, you compare that with what happens in the Gospel of Matthew. His disciples are afraid. They're caught in this dangerous situation. And Jesus comes and he shepherds them. He exoduses them. He brings them safely to the other side. And they confess that he is the Son of God. They themselves move from fear to faith. So you got the creation in the background. You also have the crossing of the Red Sea in the background, but that's not all. There's this very intriguing description in some of the prophets, Isaiah in particular, where they draw upon some of the mythology that was present in the ancient Near East to describe the activity of God. So in some of the Babylonian, for instance, Babylonian cosmogony, talking about how creation was made, you have the slaying of a sea monster. And that is paralleled in what Isaiah has to say. So if you look at Isaiah chapter 51, verses 9 and 10, it says, "Was it not you, God, was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces?" Rahab being the name of this ancient sea monster that pierced the dragon. "Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a pathway for the redeemed to pass over?" And then elsewhere in Isaiah, in chapter 30, verse 7, we read of how Rahab is a personification of Egypt. So there's a lot that's going on here, but basically Isaiah, just like preachers today, use various kinds of examples in their proclamation. So Isaiah and other prophets is using an example from common mythological stories to describe the activity of God. And he's saying, you know what? Just like the mythological sea monster Rahab was slain, that monster is like Pharaoh and the Egyptian powers that God, Yahweh, conquered there at the Red Sea. Now, this also fits in with what Jesus is doing, because he is there to when he crosses the water, to declare that he is the one who is in charge of creation. And he is the one who is going to bring creation in subjection to himself by his powerful word. So this particular crossing is a foreshadowing, more or less, of how he's going to finally destroy all the powers of darkness and destroy the work of the devil in his resurrection. So just like Isaiah drew upon this mythology to describe how Yahweh was victorious over the waters, so we have Jesus being now victorious over the waters of the Sea of Galilee. Okay, one more layer. And this is what you might call the baptismal layer, if you will. It's kind of pulling together all of these particular parts of the story. So what happens at baptism? Well, Christ as creator is once more present at the waters. You have the Spirit hovering there, just like it was hovering at the baptism of Jesus, in order to bring his people from death to life. He's bringing them into this new creation of himself. It's also a parallel to what happened in the Exodus and the crossing of the Red Sea, because now, just like Paul uses the crossing of the Red Sea in 1 Corinthians as an illustration of baptism, so the crossing of the Sea of Galilee is also connected to baptisms. In both of these, you have God bringing you through the waters safely to the other side, from fear to faith, from not believing to believing. So you have this baptismal imagery here as well, in which God is, as creator, is bringing you to a new creation, as redeemer is bringing you into a new exodus, and then finally as victor over all the forces of darkness is transferring you from the domain of darkness in baptism into the kingdom of light. So all of this together provides us with this beautiful picture, like a transparency, if you will, of how God is active from the beginning of creation all the way to the end of creation, to really to the last day, using water in various ways in order to do good for his people. He's creating via water. He's recreating via water. He's redeeming. He's restoring. He's exodusing. He's bringing people to faith. He's baptizing them into his kingdom of light. So all of this together is provided for us in Matthew's gospel. When you read that particular gospel in light of everything else that has been happening in the scriptures. Well, as always, thank you for watching, and I hope that this is going to be beneficial to you as you meditate upon this gospel reading, as you maybe teach or preach based upon it, and may God continue to lead you to a deeper understanding of his word and to a greater appreciation for how all of these stories from beginning to end are mingling together to provide for us this big picture of the salvation that we have in the Messiah. Have a great day, and may God's peace be with each of you.